I would like to introduce a friend of mine, Carol Durst, who I have known for many, many years because together we had a program here at the library which was extremely successful and long running. It was called Menus in the Movies, which was a film series about food and film. We've had to discontinue that because of COVID, but she has written a book, and it's called Vignettes and Vinaigrettes. So please, from home, welcome Carol Durst Wertheim. Thank you, Carol.
And thank you, Joan, and thank you for keeping so many programs Zooming that we all can feel connected, even if we can't physically share the space. I miss everybody. I miss interacting with people. And because of the registration for this program, we're conducting it as a webinar rather than an interactive Zoom meeting. But please make use of the chat function and type in a word or a question if you have one. Joan has promised to help me field some of those questions to make sure that this hour passes in a way that's of interest to all of you. Some of you do know me as having run food films for the library for almost 20 years. In addition, I've been teaching in culinary arts, and I've been in the food industry in New York City for much of the last 30 years. I landed in the food industry in kind of a backwards way, in that I wasn't a foodie. I was coming to the food industry as a school administrator. A friend of mine, a professional association, introduced me to her son and actually got her son to listen to her. He hired me. And my first job in the food industry was as the director of the New York Restaurant School. It was a program of the New School for Social Research in New York, and we were teaching people how to cook and bake professionally, how to run restaurants. And in 18 weeks, folks came in, went through, and went out into the industry. And I ran that program for about 2.5 years. Then I resigned as director after I conducted a graduation party on Saturday night. And Monday, I came into the school in my whites as a student. The faculty were only certain that I was trying to get one more evaluation on them, which was not the case. I had decided that I was pretty well done with my career in academic administration at that point. And I went through the program, graduated, and 2 weeks after graduation, I catered my first party, which was cocktails for 300 for the Fabric House, Brunswick, and Fee. You know, I hired all of my classmates who didn't already have jobs, and I launched. I began catering and continued to cater in New York City for about 15 years while doing a number of other things. I was teaching adults, I was doing food styling and recipe developing and TV work, and I wrote encyclopedia items and articles for magazines and newspapers. And then around the year 2000, I said, time to go back and finish my doctorate. And I did. I went back to school and began researching women in the food industry. And the statistics at that point were pretty awful, and the statistics today are still pretty awful. Women just don't do really well in restaurants. They have a hard time getting funding. They have a hard time staying the course for the years of training and experience in order to get to run their own restaurants. And it's just been a tough haul. There's a whole lot of sexual harassment, a whole lot of intensive learning disabilities, a whole lot of issues against minority women. And despite the fact that more than half the food industry workers are women, most of them are at the entry-level positions, the hourly workers, the lowest pay and the worst benefits. And it takes years to move up from that starting point, even with academic training behind you. And the statistics haven't changed all that much in my career during my years, which saddens me. I've always been involved in helping women, and particularly minority women, move their careers forward. I've really dedicated a lot of years to that and wish I could report better results. At the beginning that I entered the food industry, something like 4% maybe 4% of women could call themselves chefs. Now we're up to 7 or 8%. So looking at percentages, I can say we've doubled our numbers, but looking at the reality, women are not in the leadership positions that they should be in. And for most of my career, the women who were succeeding, defining success in a lot of different ways, but those who really felt good about their careers in the food industry had gone out on their own as freelancers, or they had set up their own business, or they were struggling somehow to create work that allowed them to balance work and personal life. And I'd like to read one piece for you this afternoon about, it's called Applause from the Manhattan Theater Club, which gives a bit of an inkling of how I began to juggle having a son and keeping my catering business going. So without undue anything, I'll just start to read this piece called Applause from the Manhattan Theater Club.
Carol, before you go, I just want to, before you start reading, I just want to mention to everybody that we're going to be, we are recording this program. And so if you know of anybody who's interested in this program, you could go on our website and look it up and give them the link to the program. We do this with all our programs, and I know a lot of people go on our website to get these archive videos. Okay, I will now stop my bit again and turn it over to you again.
No problem. I do want to explain one little piece. In working on my dissertation, I was doing research on women in the food industry, and there was such a paucity of data and so few real explanations of what happened for women that I began, as a second aspect of the dissertation, to write vignettes, small stories about my own experiences working in the food industry. Of course, because I had worked at 24 different kinds of paying jobs, I have a range of different stories. But for this book, I decided to focus on the catering experiences, which were my primary way of earning a living in the 1980s and 1990s. So here we are, Applause from the Manhattan Theater Club. When I was called as a subscriber and asked for a donation, I whined that I couldn't afford to give more than the subscription tickets I had already purchased. Then I paused and I asked, but I have a small catering business. Would the theater company want me to cater any events for them? That offer traveled quickly up the line in the development office, and by the end of the week, I had a minuscule budget to cater a party opening the next production. After that, it was a quick shuffle step to a very regular gig. I read each script while the play was in rehearsal. I was given a very limited budget and free rein to create a menu that fit the theme of the show. I loved the plays, the young artistic staff, and the creative menu challenges. Manhattan Theater Club was pleased to serve innovative, sometimes even exotic menus on their box wine and cheddar cheese budget. At the time, no one thought to serve pierogies on a skewer mixed with garlicky kielbasa for the Polish play. My tiny cream currant scones and lemon curd tartlets were a sweet surprise at the British production, and the buttermilk biscuits with the slim slice of ham worked well and was not messy for the Tennessee Williams revival. This was how we worked in 1984, when the Manhattan Theater Club began to use the performance space on the lower level of City Center on East 55th Street, New York City. It was an intense time of tight budgets and creative challenge, technical difficulties, and a driving conviction that this theater company had to grow. Barry Grove, the business manager at that time, and Lynn Meadows, the artistic director, wanted innovative champagne catering, but their limited funds went for the new lighting board. They could not quite afford even a beer menu. So my New American Catering Corporation became part of the theater family. We were insiders. I waived my profit, charged only to cover food, transportation costs, and staff wages, and began a long-term relationship with the Manhattan Theater Company and New American Catering Corporation that justified my little company's placement right up there with the Fortune 500 sponsors in their playbill. Folded tables were opened and set in place. We used old props for our catering setups. And we covered the blemished theater tables with draperies and fabrics the MTC staff found. Flowers I bought half price that morning at the wholesale market became arrangements, tweaked and placed to catch the available spot lighting and to hide their wilting blooms. Baskets were upended to prop up other baskets, to fill visual voids, to position the inexpensive foods strategically for great access, guest access, and colorful impressions, with beverage napkins fanned out in neat arcs on front table corners. My baskets and basic black trays served in multiple disguises. No one got excited when something broke. Most of my staff worked both sides of the lights, and when they didn't have their own shows booked, they were happy to book catering performances for some steady income as we grew close to the theater company staff. We arrived just after the curtain rose at 8:05 p.m. to haul our food and serving equipment down the stairs into the temporary management office. And as the renovation projects shifted, we were shifted into the back dressing room. We set up food trays on any horizontal surfaces available for the night, trusting the Department of Health, inspectors had gone home already. And we plotted lobby traffic flow while the audience watched the first act. We were totally out of sight during the intermission, but when the second curtain went up, my SWAT team swung into action. Half an hour later, when the house bartenders finally cleaned up their station and put away their cash and liquor, we pounced on the bar to line up steady plastic tumblers of Pinot Grigio and chilled water that our budget allowed. We served 6 shows a year, board of director events, staged readings, fundraisers. We were hired upstairs as well in the main entrance lobby when City Center hosted fundraisers for Twyla Tharp and other young startup companies. We were fast in and out, left everything clean and neat, as though hundreds of hungry hordes had not just passed through a National Historic Landmark. I thought it was supposed to be that way. That was how we worked in anyone's home, and it was our standard. Years later, I understood that our standard made my company special, and it was not the way most companies actually operated at the time. My fall seasons were marked by the invitational call from the Manhattan Theater Company Development Office. It began as a proper pas de deux dance performance, the opening flourish and position held on point for the curtain rising. Then we swung into a standard theatrical dress rehearsal, overly dramatic expressions of mutual affection and careful discussions of how busy we all were. Everyone marked their positions, blocked the scene from all positions. Then came more practice dialogue to move the plot forward. Would New American Catering Corporation still be able to support Manhattan Theater Club this year? And then my simple but passionate affirmation, ah, yes. And the curtain would rise. I leaped into their outstretched arms and our dance partnership was renewed for another season. I loved being part of this theater company. I got to know the administrators, the stage managers, the stars, and all the lovely young women who worked in the development office. As they matured, one moved on to development work with Jacques D'Amboise and his National Dance Institute, taking me along to break and rescue hollandaise at his brownstone dinner parties. Another moved to Park Avenue and 79th Street, where I appeared regularly in her kitchen as she attended to her husband's formal business entertainments. My connection with the director of development was a personal friendship that reached across the widest seasons of our private lives as our parents aged, siblings' marriages ended, and her young sons outgrew bunk beds in the Little League. In the fall of 1986, when I confirmed with my, ah, yes, I didn't know I was pregnant. I didn't realize for another 3 months that pregnancy was bloating my belly, swirling my brain, draining my memory, and altering my tastes for coffee, broccoli, liver. I couldn't say it. I was taking Metamucil for weeks until my doctor insisted I take a break in my crazy schedule and come in for an examination. Before I undressed, he looked at me across his desk. "You're pregnant." The blood test proved him right. He was an extraordinary diagnostician, and he knew me well. It was a bit shocking to realize at 30-something that I had missed my first trimester, but I was delighted with the news. I began to figure out what I needed as I gathered baby information: my due date, diabetes test, sonogram, amniocentesis. My buddy Tom lent me his size 46 chef's jacket. The baby was due on June 8th, and my last booking with the Manhattan Theater Club was June 7th. I had never had a baby before, but began immediate conversations with the meat pie, as we named this continuously expanding protrusion of my girth, explaining to him that he couldn't come early. A few months later, I booked an opening cocktail party for a bank headquarters on June 18th, and took time again to explain to the creature now kicking in my belly that he couldn't arrive too very late either. I was reading about kids needing parents to set boundaries. But the Manhattan Theater Club leaders, watching my burgeoning belly, grew concerned about the timing for their last event. "Don't worry, folks. Crew has been through this so many times, they'll do fine, even if I'm on my way to the hospital that night." The company managers were not totally ready to go with me on that. They wanted a backup plan. Several of the young women from development offered to understudy for me. They had watched our fun setting up in the dressing room. They adored the repartee with the handsome young men in tuxedos, and they loved the food. We all agreed we'd play it by ear and improvise. I kept talking respectfully to my meat pie as he grew and grew, gathering a name, leg strength, and personality. I was sure we had an understanding. I felt just fine after those early months of flu-like symptoms. Happily, although slowly, I shopped, prepped, and packed up that June 7th party, and we made it to the final curtain of the season. Show over, lights up, joyful crowd, good party buzz. Afterward, we cleaned up, packed, and my crew hauled my equipment up the staircase as the MTC staff gathered in the lobby, now returned to its pristine state. I was always the last out the door, making one final sweep to look for the forgotten wine glass, the beverage napkin missed under a table, the last goodbyes for the season. And this evening, the executive producer, Barry Grove, took my hand. I thought he was about to lead me into a waltz, but instead he escorted me to the handicapped chair attached to the rail on the staircase, and gently shoved my enlarged, unbalanced person into the chair and pushed the button. As the machine slowly lifted my hugeness up the stairwell, the entire MTC staff gathered in the lobby and gave me a standing ovation. I couldn't lean forward to bow much more than a nod, but the glory of that ovation still resounds for me. My labor began the following day, and Will was born on June 10th, 1987, right on cue and cooperating with the professional window I had allowed, just as we had discussed for the last several months. And I don't know how many of you have ever tried to shop for professional clothing, but in the 1980s, there was no such thing as a chef's jacket cut for someone who was pregnant. So a size 46 jacket could envelope me and my baby, but it was really not a very aesthetic look at the time.
Carol, I just love the story. I mean, I've read a couple of that, but I never read the Manhattan Theater Club story. I was reduced to laughter at a lot of parts. I'm sure most of the audience was too. What a wonderful life you had pre me knowing you. It was really fun. I just love the stories. And everyone should know that the book, that's what it's full of. It's just a wonderful book. And before we go any further, I just want to tell everybody that the book is available online at Amazon.com, and you can get it at your local bookstore. And if you're interested and you would like to have it autographed, you just have to purchase it at the local bookstore. Carol will go there and sign it for you. It has to be obviously local around the Chappaqua, Northern Westchester area. So we're hoping you will do that. And if not, you could purchase the book through her, and we will have on the scroll will be her email address. Carol, if you want now to probably write it out on the chat function, so you can
Sure.
see it on the chat function too, if you want to do that. Will you purchase it from her, and she could also personalize the book. So Carol's going to put that up right now. And we would like to now open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions, please do that now. Any questions?
While I'm waiting for the chat to begin, I want to say how deeply concerned I am about all the folks in the theater industry in New York City right now. Over my years of catering, most of the people who work with me were dancers or were performers, as you probably understood from the story. And they all hungered for their roles in films and TV and, on shows. And none of that is happening right now. So a lot of people are just unemployed. And if anybody can think of ways to help support those theater companies or some of the small local restaurants, please take the initiative to do so. They really do need you. All of the arts need us right now. Stories I can share about celebrities I encountered. But one of my pieces is called I Fed Al Pacino. And that's probably a name you recognize. And even though I haven't fed him or seen him in the last 30 years, anytime I've mentioned his name, that people seem to want to know, well, what was that like? What was that like? So I'll leave you with the suspense of having to read the piece in the book. It was a marvelous experience for me. Let me say that. It's quite extraordinary to understand how complicated life can be when you're such a well-known face, and how many people actually are involved backstage to try to support a life that is so public. I worked for Mick Jagger. I actually catered his 40th birthday party at the Palladium in New York. And I also worked for Daryl Hannah long before we knew her from Splash. Actually, I think it was 2 years before Splash, she was in New York making a film with Robert Redford, and she, as a vegetarian, wanted her dinner or her breakfast at 3 in the afternoon, whatever the meal was. But I was cooking for her at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I've also had many different famous people attending different parties as I catered in some very affluent homes, as well as, roadrunners races on the streets of New York. You're amazed to learn that women are not leaders in the restaurant industry. Well, it is kind of stunning. And the factors that I think it has largely to do with have to do with that balancing act of trying to have a family and work. As late as 1995, to my knowledge, there was no company producing chef's jackets which would fit or were styled for women. And so absolutely none could accommodate a pregnancy. Many women have reported sexual harassment and or assault in restaurants. And we know some of the big names, that you've heard more recently. Mario Batali, among others, had his rape room upstairs with a woman chef downstairs.
Yes, we can hear that.
In that episode, I knew of that, confirmed by multiple sources within the industry, probably 3 years before it ever made the press, maybe longer. So, women did talk to among ourselves. We do know how hard it is. But I've belonged to a professional association called Women Chefs and Restaurateurs, and I ran a mentoring program for them for 6 years, trying to get more experienced women chefs to help younger people figure out their work-life balance and figure out how do you move your career forward. And inevitably, money would become the problem. Women were not getting backing for their ventures. Some years ago, there was a Rocco Di Spirito who was handed over $1 million to open a restaurant and to make a TV show out of his opening. And his restaurant was a total flop. And he walked away with whatever thousands of dollars or millions were left over. I don't know. But nobody would throw millions of dollars at women for a risky venture. I had a business in New York. I was a subchapter S corporation. I was legal. I paid my taxes. I paid my purveyors. I paid my staff for 15 years. And I would walk into a bank and they would say, Carol, you have a 10-speed bicycle and a rent-stabilized lease and your pots and pans. I can't give you a business loan. And that was the story in the 1980s. It was very, very tough. Is there another question?
No, I think.
What did I make for cocktails for 300 on my first catering?
I don't. Wait, I just want to tell you, I'm not getting the questions and I don't know why, but I'm glad you got the question. Okay, just read the question and then answer it. Okay.
I'm sorry, the question that I'm looking at now says, what did I make for cocktails for 300 as my first catering job? And mind you, I was 2 weeks out of cooking school. What had happened was Brunswick and Fee had called someone I knew who had had a catering business, and she had sold her catering business and signed a non-compete clause. So she was not allowed to book the party. So she had called me up and said, Carol, you book the party and I'll tell you what to do. And that's how we worked it. I signed the contract. I knew the staff to hire. She didn't have staff anymore. And at that point, she said, oh, well, we'll do a roast suckling pig and we'll do this, this, and this, because the Fabric House was releasing 17th century after the hunt themed fabrics. So we came up with a medieval menu, some of which I produced, some of which she produced. And it turns out at the end of 2 weeks, I very clearly understood that she did not know the math necessary for a catered event. She didn't know what would make money. She didn't know how many pieces of anything to make. She didn't know any of the math that I thought was implicit in creating a business. So I had a 2-week crash course in catering, and we served skewered meat pies, we skewered all kinds of different things, and we had a roast pig. And now, as soon as that party was booked, I went looking for who knows how to carve a pig at a cocktail party into little slim bites to put on a baguette, a slice of baguette. And the only person I knew was my then boyfriend, now husband, whose grandfather had been a butcher. So we grabbed Les when he came after work to the cocktail party. We took off his suit and tie and slapped him into a chef's jacket, stuck a toque on his head, and sent him out to stand at the party, slicing off small bits of the pig, the roast pig, and the condiments to go on it. And so he was busy making up how one cooks a pig, because that's what the audience was asking him. And of all my staff, he was the only one who didn't have a clue how to cook anything. That's how we got through my first party.
That's a wonderful story. I'll have to tell Leslie has a new qualification that I never knew about.
Oh,
and you probably never knew that in Chappaqua on Community Day, they used to roast a pig as one of the events that the whole town would circle around. I think it was the Rotary Club that did it. And you were able to get a slice of pig meat. I think maybe if the Rotary did it again, I will volunteer less.
I wouldn't recommend it. I think I could do a better job at this point. But it was a lot of fun as a way to start. It was just delightful.
Okay, they want the email address. Why don't you mention it, but I will be sure it goes on the scroll when this is edited. They're not going to everybody. It's only going to the panelists.
Okay, I don't
know. So it's C, well, Carol, you're better off at mentioning it.
C as in Carol, G as in go, D as in David, URST at outlook.com. And I believe Joan is going to ask Carrie to put that onto the tape when this is archived and made public, and that'll happen in just a couple of days. I'd be happy to answer anyone's email, and if anybody would like a copy or would like to make arrangements to purchase a copy of the book, please feel free to write to me. I am around, and I'm happy to talk about food industry work. The book actually costs, I think it's about $18 on Amazon, although there's a discount rate. And if you wanted to deal with me directly, I will sign a book and mail it to you. And that we can do for about $15, so that it covers the cost of my book and it covers the cost of the mailing.
Right.
Happy to do it for you. Happy to.
And
Or
I think it would be
local
just a
bookstores.
wonderful, holiday gift. I know it's a little early, but you know, many of us have maybe children or relatives that are in the food industry and would love. This is just a lovely book to curl up with when you need a lift, because listening to Carol read the story was wonderful. And when we all need a bit of a lift right now, and this would be just a wonderful book to curl up with. Of course, are there any, there's no recipes in it. I didn't see any recipes. You didn't put anything in here.
I actually tucked in a couple of recipes.
Oh, did you? Then I didn't look at it carefully enough.
It's not the main thrust of it.
Right.
Erica Gottesman has a hand raised. Joan, are you able?
Don't use that. If she could type it in, it works for us better. So please type in any questions in the chat function. You see the chat function is on your menu. You might have to move your mouse if it's on a laptop or a desktop. Just move it and you'll see the chat function. It's usually in, it's like a little rectangle that you might see in a cartoon when a character is talking. And then once you hit that icon, you can type in a question. And I am really not seeing these questions the way I should. I don't know why.
There is a question about the Pleasantville Village Bookstore. If you contact them and ask them to get a book for you, it's available through major distribution. If you ask them to get a book for you and let me know, I will be happy to go to the bookstore and sign the book for you, make sure you're able to pick it up there. Okay.
Right.
Challenges for paleo, etc. I have one story in the book actually that is about the election when Reagan won, and a number of us thought, oh, Democrats are going to win, and Democrats did not win. And I had been hired to cater an election night party, and the other surprise, in addition to Reagan winning the election, the other surprise was how many of the people attending were actually vegetarian. And this, of course, goes back to the 1980s. And I was a little surprised. I didn't have preparation of foods for vegetarians, which in today's market, you absolutely would. There's no caterer who would think of creating a menu that did not make a plan or accommodate a vegetarian attending. And these days, it's probably as much as 25% of population.
Really?
We would request a vegetarian or a vegan option at a catered event. So it's clear catering, it has changed dramatically from the 1980s when, my God, if I showed up for a Christmas party with a Saint Andre cheese from France and fresh cherries that came up from Chile, wow, was I a big success. Well, the world has changed. You know, the seasonality of food is respected differently in the New York area, certainly. There's a lot of other changes as well in how people are working. And when I was a kid, I mean, if anyone had asked my parents, well, do you think Carol will go into the food industry? If someone looked at a letter that a friend of my folks wrote me, you know, thanking me for sending him chocolate chip cookies. It was a man who was very ill. and I made a delivery of chocolate chip cookies that I had baked. And he wrote this thank you letter addressed to Carol's Cookie Company. If anyone had thought about that when I was 12, thought about my arts interest, other things that were true for me, they might have suggested the food industry. But that was just not what smart girls from Brooklyn were supposed to be doing. I had to go to liberal arts college, and it took me years before I figured out that a catering business was really a very good fit for me. And I enjoy doing that work more than just about everything else I've done. And I've done a lot of different kinds of work since then.
Well, somebody who's been a benefit of a lot of your cooking, because when we were doing the menus in the movie film series, Carol would always bring food that related somehow to the film. Like when we did the chocolate film with Lena Olin, she brought a selection of chocolates for us to taste. And when we did Waitress, she brought, what, 12 or 13 12-inch pies. I will never forget you bringing them all in. Well, I guess I helped. And it was just totally amazing. And she's a delicious cook.
Thank you very much for those testaments. But in fact, in the food industry, the food itself is only part of the picture. If you can't figure out how to sell the food, how to market it, how to get the right price for it, don't stay in business for very long. You just can't. You lose your shirt, as it were. Someone has asked food styling, what that actually means. Food styling, in my experience, was about making sure that anything that was going to be photographed for a magazine or on television, that it was perfect, that it just looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. I was catering and doing the preparation and the food styling for Julie Rosso at one time when she had a series of interviews. She was in one location, but she was being interviewed from 7 or 8 different places, kind of like Zoom. But each time they ran a new interview, we had to have a total setup for her trifle dish. Now, a trifle is a layered dessert with a lot of different elements and a glass-footed bowl. And I had to have 7 complete setups for her to move from one to the next interview. So that was the food styling for one event. Other times I had worked on the Rosie O'Donnell show, and her stage manager, it happened to be, St. Patrick's Day, and the stage manager had somehow acquired blobs of corned beef, big chunks of cabbage, and a pile of potatoes, and he needed a beauty shot, which would be a still shot as they faded from one scene to another. And he had these things in huge tubs. And he looked at me and he said, "Haven't you got a platter you could put that on?" I had, 3 minutes, and I had to set up a nicely designed plate of what corned beef and cabbage should look like. That would be a kind of food styling. Someone else
wants to know if they're responsible for flowers and decorations.
I was at the time that I did catering. These days, very often, there are people paid for arranging props, people who are paid to arrange tents and seating. Someone else is hired for a wedding to design how the table will look. And of course, there'd be florists and photographers to boot. I did an awful lot of that myself when I was working on really tight budgets, in order just to be able to shave a few hundred off here and there. Somebody asked, has anyone ever gotten ill from a healthy diet? I'm not quite sure what that question is, but I will tell you that I am trained and certified to teach ServSafe, which is the National Restaurant Association instruction to industry professionals on how not to poison people. So I took the training. I was New York City Board of Health certified as well, because when I hung out my shingle as a caterer, I said I take it very seriously to not make people sick. And so it was always part of my furthering others' education to say, you've got to be responsible about how you handle food and that you not make anyone sick. And knock on wood, as they say, I never had anyone claim that I had made them sick in 15 years of catering in New York City. And recognizing how litigious this society is, that that may be a very special,
That says a lot.
asterisk on my name.
That certainly says a lot, Carol. Well, the next question is, are any of your foods that you use in styling edible afterwards?
Most are. Years ago, and when I started, there used to be an awful lot of Vaseline used on Q-tips to make ice cream look glimmering. Ice cream was not ice cream under those hot Klieg lights. Ice cream was made out of, I don't know, something gelatinous, and then touched up to look like ice cream. In my experience, I've always used edible food, and most times the crew working on the TV set or in the photo shoot would gobble it down, as soon as the photographs were done. So I didn't subscribe to the artificial elements or the food dyes and stuff. And my favorite story about that is Wertheim Grosvenor, who was a 6-foot-tall Southern woman, had me do her food styling for the TV Food Network. And she had a rice pudding, and I prepared the rice pudding in advance, and I made it 6 different times because it weeped. That is, when you bake it, some of the whey from the milk that was in there would separate. And I was so apologetic, and I was sure I'd done something wrong, and I brought her all these different versions, and I said, now, which one do you want for your beauty shop? Because, do you want me to take the whey off? Do you want me to do something to it? And she looked me in the eye and she said, no, dear, honey, that's how it looks. And I said, that's what I wanted. I want food that's real. It's okay if it's imperfect. And as my father used to say, well, he would eat the burnt corners of something. And he said, my stomach doesn't mind. My stomach doesn't mind what it looks like.
Well, this was wonderful. If there's any other questions, please type them in now because we're running to the time we'll end the program. So Carol, I love these stories. I knew you cooked for celebrities, but I didn't know to what extent.
Plenty of them.
You have great memories, that's for sure.
Did I cook?
Did you cook after working?
Well, if you were in my house, you would see food for 40 or food for 300 or parts of dishes for an awful lot. It was around. And so I wouldn't always come home and cook dinner. Sometimes poor Les had to just, fend for himself or live off some leftover pate or, he had to cope.
Doesn't sound like it was hard.
I still have not figured out how to cook for 2, to be perfectly frank. It wouldn't faze me at all if you said, Carol, would you knock together dinner for 30? No problem. But dinner for 2 stumps me most nights of the week. I just, there's always food for 4 or 6, and I just don't get the little quantities. I even bought some smaller pots to try to control myself and train myself.
Didn't work. Okay. All right. I thoroughly enjoyed it, as I'm sure so many people in the audience enjoyed this talk. So Carol, thank you very much. I hope you will all purchase the book. As we said, it's on Amazon.com, or you could write to Carol, which is cgdurst, D-U-R-S-T, @outlook.com, or you could go to your local bookstore. Any of these options are open to you. And I thank you, Carol. What? Oh,
thank you.
Just waving by. Okay. Thank you all for attending, and I hope we'll see you on Monday when we have Scott Hibbert talking about foreign policy, which is at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 5th. So have a good weekend, and we'll see you at the other programs. Bye-bye.
Eat well.
Oh, eat well. Nice.